All right, let's jump right in. When you hear the name Cleopatra, what comes to mind? The siren of the Nile, right? The great seductress. But what if that whole story, the one that's all about romance and affairs, what if it's actually the first and maybe the most successful PR spin in all of history? What if her real story is actually a masterclass in dealing with catastrophic failure?
This quote from the historian Stacy Schiff just nails it. History gets written by the winners, and the story they wrote was a caricature. Think about it. It's way less threatening to believe a powerful woman was just fatally attractive rather than fatally intelligent. So we're going to look at her life, not as some great romance, but as an incredible playbook for bouncing back from failure.
So a lot of career experts today, they call our work lives permanent whitewater. Just constant turbulence, constant change and disruption. But for Cleopatra, this wasn't some business school metaphor. It was her day-to-day reality, trying to rule Egypt while being stuck in the giant shadow of Rome, which was busy tearing itself apart. Okay, so let's get into it. The Queen of Comebacks. Her story and the playbook we're building really starts with her first huge career disaster. She's only 21, and she finds herself on the losing end of a civil war against her own brother, Ptolemy XIII. I mean, just think about this. She's lost literally everything. Her throne, her city, all her power. She's a fugitive, hiding out in the desert. As far as she's concerned, it is game over. But this right here, this is where her playbook truly begins. And that brings us to the next chapter, experiments in power. Modern business strategists, they tell us to treat our careers like a series of experiments. And in that mindset, failure isn't the end. It's just data. It tells you what to try next. Yeah, it's called the experiment mindset. When something blows up in a lab, the scientist doesn't take it personally, right? It's just a signal to learn something, rethink, and start a new experiment. So instead of accepting exile as this huge personal failure, Cleopatra used the data she had and ran one of the boldest experiments in political history.
Okay, so just look at this plan. It's absolutely audacious. The most powerful man in the world, Julius Caesar, had just rolled into her city. So what does she do? She sneaks back, gets smuggled past all the enemy soldiers, and then, get this, has herself delivered directly to Caesar, rolled up inside a carpet or a sturdy sack. I mean, talk about making an entrance. This wasn't just drama, though. This was a massive strategic risk that completely flipped the script and put her right back on the throne. But like we said, in a world of permanent whitewater, success doesn't last forever. Years go by, and now she's allied with Mark Antony. Together, they face their biggest test yet, an all-out war against the guy who would become the first emperor of Rome, Octavian. And this leads to her biggest failure of all. The stakes here were just immense. The Battle of Actium was basically for control of the entire known world. And if you look at the numbers, on paper, Antony and Cleopatra had a huge advantage in ships and a decent edge in soldiers. They should have had this. But they didn't. They were completely and utterly defeated. And this wasn't like losing a big project at work or missing out on a promotion. No. This was the end of a war, the end of an entire empire, and the end of a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 300 years. And this really shows you what happens after a failure of that magnitude. Psychologists tell us that huge setbacks like this, they trigger a loss of identity, tons of stress, and they just crush your confidence. And that is exactly what happened to Mark Antony. He completely fell apart, built this little cottage and named it after a famous hermit who hated people. His entire identity was shattered. But Cleopatra, what about her? As Octavian's army was closing in, Cleopatra rolled out her final strategy. It's something that resilience experts today call reframing the narrative. The idea is when you can no longer control the outcome, you can still control the story. See, she knew exactly what Octavian had planned. He wanted to drag her through the streets of Rome in chains. It was going to be the ultimate symbol of his victory and her total humiliation. That was his story, and she absolutely refused to let him be the one to write that final chapter. So her final defiant act was to choose her own end. And by doing that, she grabbed control of her own story. Even her conqueror, Octavian, was apparently in awe of her lofty spirit in that moment. She couldn't win the war, no, but in a very real way, she won the narrative of her death.
And this is where we see just how powerful controlling the story is. To make his own victory seem even bigger, Octavian and his supporters spent years recasting her as this evil, power-hungry temptress. They just erased her political genius, dialed up the sexuality, and created the story that has somehow stuck around for 2,000 years.
So, the big question is, what's the takeaway for us? How do we apply her playbook after our own battle of Actiums? Whether it's getting laid off, a huge project failing, or just a massive career pivot. It really boils down to these key strategies, all of which she pulled off. First, reframe your failure. Don't let anybody else write your story for you. Second, treat setbacks like experiments. They're just giving you data for your next big move. Third, build that resilience so you can think clearly when everyone else, like Antony, is losing their cool. And of course, don't try to go it alone. Build those powerful partnerships that make you even stronger.
When you strip away all the propaganda, Cleopatra's story is this incredible lesson that how we deal with our failures is what really defines us in the end. I mean, she turned being exiled into a throne and turned total, crushing defeat into a legacy that has lasted for millennia. So the real question is, how will you use your failures to define yourself?